Next question is about today the content of administration law is driven primarily the scope of public administration. The scope of public administration driven by content. Content of administration law is driven primarily by the scope of public administration. Administrative law, in its widest sense, imply the whole body of law relating to public administration. According Bethamley, administrative law is the sum total of principle according to which the activity of service concerned with the execution of law is exercised. It is one of the two great branches of public law, other being constitutional law. So James Hart divided the field of administration law into the law of internal administration and law of external administration. The law of internal administration elucidate the nature of public office, or what Goodenough calls office relation. Administrative law is that body of law which concern the functions of administration and the relation of administration authority with individual as well as authority. It does not, however, deal with organization of this administration authority and their internal problem which come within the scope of public administration. The various category of administrative authority boost power, duty and public corporation administration, tribunal and local authority. Administrative law deal with power of these administrative authority, the legal relationship between such authority and the individual, and the justifiable right of individual as against the administration. Although law relating to public administration has existed all country at the time, its modern growth in the advanced industrial country has been so phenomenal and peculiar as to constitute, in the word Professor Robson, as new development. This what has been the circumstances responsible for the exuberant growth, and what is the nature purpose which may be regarded as peculiar for our time. As for this cursed growth, they are mainly to be found in vast expansion of function of the government, philosophy of individual prevalent during 18th to 19th century. Under the impact of industrialization, urbanization, the individualist or laissez-faire doctrine of state function could work. These was cut and dried legal rules and followed. Thus, administration law may require that the railway rail structure should be responsible, that drainage system shall be reasonable, adequate, that unfair practice shall not be allowed in certain important sector of trade and commerce. So this was quite boring but quite interesting. Today the content of administration law is driven primarily by the scope of public administration. So administrative law, how it is related to the public administration. See, administrative law is that portion of nation legal system which determine the legal status and liability of the state official, and secondly define the right liability of private individual in their dealing with public officials, and thirdly specify the procedure by which those rights and liability are performed. So now scope of public administration is changing, widening, and content of administration law is also changing. First of all, the socio-economic function of state is growing. So content of administration law is byproduct of growing socio-economic function of a state and increased power of government. In the modern time, public administration, the state has undertaken multifarious function. Beside the traditional function, the public administration now doing various developmental and welfare function. In this process, enormous power has been conferred on government and public administration. In these circumstances, the ordinary citizen were found to come into direct contact with the confrontation with the administration. Administration law is being increasingly developed to prevent the administration from degeneration into arbitrariness and unfair and abuse of its power. So industrialization, concentration of large section of population is overcrowded city create problem, housing, disease, smoke, insecurity, life that could not be ignored. The administration had to intervene in the interest of public safety, health, since states today assume the role of material state. The multifarious activity of state extend to social problems such as health, education, employment, old age pension, operation of public utility. This both a change in role of administration. To meet those requirements, administration has to armed with legislative and judicial power, because for legislation it was practically impossible to work out detail of every legislation with aptitude. It could only afford to lay down broad policy while entrusting up executive the power to work detail by making rules, regulation, orders, ordinance, directions. So scientific and technological development has resulted in creation of new problems like urbanization, environment pollution, transportation, traffic, automation, and consequential effect problem of employment. Modernization of present society has given rise to new types of socio-economic offense like concentration of wealth, adulteration, smuggling, tax evasion, labor problem, unhealthy commercial practice. All these problems necessitate as number of law to be enacted and power of administration authority to be increased for their proper solution. So fulfilling the needs of great number of law providing for the superstructure administration power administrative law subject to momentous significance. The increased power of administration authority, effective control to much power has inbuilt seeds the corruption, misuse or abuse of power. It leads to negation of right of people, rule of law, democracy. Here come in the importance of public administration because it is the administration law which has function of legitimation of due power and to control misuse of it. In brief, the growing consciousness of age, the increasing complexity of modern administration, and incredible rise in tempo. So, manifold science and technology to habits of life are responsible for growth and development. Next is delegated legislation is the necessary evil. The delegated legislation form an essential part of the delegated legislation is the essential part of the today administrative law. With rising scope of administrative law, the scope of delegated legislation is also rising. The delegated legislation is nothing but delegation of legislative power to the executive. The need for specialization, paucity of time, and there are other factors which contribute for excessive delegation. The inevitability of the delegated legislation on the welfare state is beyond dispute, since delegated legislation is necessary evil and is likely to increase in volume rather than diminish in view of complex social organization and vast development promotional activity that has modern government undertaken. Some safeguard and control are necessary and desirable to avoid usurpation of absolute power by delegated legislation. The system of delegated legislation come in for a lot of criticism. At the hand of critics, it has aroused moral fear, led some thinker to identify it with the virtual renunciation of democracy. The system of delegated legislation by parliament, a power of legislation within certain limits is necessary. At least it's regard matter of detail because it is impossible if only for want of time for parliament to deal adequately and in detail with all the matters calling. So sometimes the empowering the executive with enormous power authority imply almost like giving a blank check. So what are the drawback of delegated legislation? It violates the principle of separation of power among the executive, uh, legislation, and judiciary. It hampers the supremacy of parliament and violates the principle of no taxation without representation. The delegated legislation can also amend even the parent law which has given the power. It can also put certain law outside the purview of judiciary and killing the scope of judicial review. The delegated legislation can also legislate upon matter relating to taxation, which are prime principle of parliament only. Thus, at last, it can be said that delegation legislation is necessary evil because does not have the time to enact details legislation on all kinds of subject on which law can be made. Still, the delegated legislation is expanding and will continue to do so in near future. Next is make a critical assessment of dicey understanding of rule of law and right administration. Make out a case of delegated legislation. Primarily, the rule of law principle requires that the legal system comply with minimum standard of certainty, generality, and equality. So, what is make the critical assessment dicey understanding of rule of law and right administration? Make out the case of delegated legislation. So primarily the rule of law principle requires that legal system comply with minimum standard of certainty, generality, equality. The rule of law is fundamental ideal principle of modern Western democracy. However, the modern history of Western democracy has shown that rule of law was not able to prevent some of the worst behavior of a state of individual with the state. It is not surprising that critics of modern Western democracy have taken the rule of law, and for Marxists, it is the legitimate ideology which discusses class-based and hegemonizing function of law. For feminists, its talk of equality, generality, and serves to continue malness of law and the law of operation of women private sphere. For a critical legal study, the rule of law opened over the fundamental contradiction of modern life, including the tension between needs of the free and desired life. Perhaps the most devastating criticism rule of law is sociological critique that is become politically and sociologically outdated. Meaning of droit is French administration. Droit administration, which means body of rules which determine the organization, power, duty of public administration and regulate the relation of administration with citizen. Droit administration does not represent the rule and principle enacted by parliament. It contains the rule developed by administrative code. Delegated legislation is law made by body other than parliament. Parliament gives other power to pass delegated legislation as parent or enabling act. So it is allowed the rapid change. MP lacks detail or technical knowledge and specific detail in abortion act, road traffic detail, quick response to new development, foot and mouth outreach. The Prevention of Terrorism Act allow the quick addition of new prohibited group, enable minor change to status and variation in sentence, approval of motor vehicle change. Judicial review may be sought by parties with local standing affecting by the so time is now vested by the parliament considering them all and model by law available from Whitehall, withdrawal or amendment easy. So this is the whole about the next chapter.